Good afternoon. I'm Molly Mansell, your librarian, and I'm so happy to welcome you back to the Oxford Union for our Trinity term. Today, I'm honoured to be joined by Sean Joyce. Sean was the 14th Deputy Director of the FBI, where he had daily oversight of 36,000 men and women and an $8 billion annual budget. He was a key figure in transforming the FBI into an intelligence-led organization, spearheading several strategic initiatives, including the Next Generation Cyber, which was a cross-organizational initiative to maintain the FBI as a world leader in law enforcement and domestic intelligence. Sean gave over 26 years of service and established himself as an accomplished leader. Within the field of technology, Sean is now the global and US cybersecurity, privacy, and forensics leader at PwC. Sean is a 2013 recipient of the Director of National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, the CIA Directors Award, the DIA Directors Award, and the FBI Meritorious Medal, and the 2011 Presidential Rank Award. As always, we'll be taking audience questions at the end, so please do use the Q&A function below to submit them. Sean, welcome.
Thanks, Molly, and hi, everyone. I'm truly honored to speak here today at the Oxford Union, to be part of a history that includes world leaders, thought leaders, and innovators. For nearly 2 centuries, the Oxford Union has brought people together to discuss the biggest issues of their days. And today, I want to focus on one of ours, and that is trust. I've spent several decades of my life dealing with people from all around the world, from all walks of life, from drug dealers to the head of MI5. A defining factor in the success of these relationships was building trust. And that's never been harder to do than it is now in today's world. Every day we're bombarded with information from television networks, social media, governments, and online forums, each providing us with their version of the truth. And most people have lost what little trust they had in institutions. And maybe even more importantly, we've lost trust in each other. But even though trust is at an all-time low, my goal is to convince you that it's on each and every one of us to restore it. And we can start by building trusting relationships in our own lives. That's easier said than done. And to illustrate that point, I want to start today by doing something just a little bit different. As you heard in my introduction, I've spent my career chasing kidnappers, bank robbers, drug lords, and terrorists. I now work at PwC as the Global Cybersecurity leader. So over the years, I've learned to read people and find the truth, not because I'm some kind of genius, but because I've done it thousands of times. They should give me an honorary doctorate in human behavior. What do you think, Oxford? And to give you a flavor of what that's like, Molly, are you willing to volunteer right now to be a subject to a relatively harmless FBI style interrogation?
Yeah, of course. I'm nervous, but I'll do it.
All right, it won't be bad. Can you tell everyone, what did you have for breakfast this morning?
I actually didn't have breakfast, which will get me in trouble because I think my mum might be watching this Zoom.
Oh my, how about lunch? Did you have lunch?
I did have lunch. I had a sandwich,
What kind of sandwich?
tuna and cucumber.
Sounds pretty nutritious, pretty good. What color shirt did you wear yesterday?
A pink shirt.
All right, it's nice. Tell me, are you above or below the average IQ at Oxford?
Maybe below. I think probably average. I hope average.
All right, it's good. And do you think you'll be more or less successful than your peers there?
Oh, I mean, I hope they'll be as successful.
Okay, all right. Thanks so much, Molly. Really appreciate you helping us out. Now, I want everyone to think about what they did when I asked Molly what she had for, I asked breakfast, but she didn't have breakfast, lunch, and then what color shirt did she wear yesterday? And if you noticed, and I would tell you to ask yourselves, when you go to access a memory, Molly actually, her eyes moved up and to the right, okay? But when I asked Molly whether she was above or below the average IQ, she did some quick thinking in her head about what that answer might mean, how she would be perceived by you. And I've done thousands of interrogations just like that. And I have to tell you, when you've done this 1,000 times, you learn that the world is full of little fabrications and big exaggerations. And what you just saw is pretty typical. I'm not picking on Molly, but you can tell when someone accesses a memory, and then when they're thinking about a question, and we all have the instinct to present the best version of ourselves, even if it means shading the truth just a little bit. Think about making that story a little bit funny at the pub, or embellishing that CV or resume just a little bit. We've all done this. In fact, in the late 90s, research found that people lied 1 out of every 5 interactions. And now in the era of social media, everyone has a microphone. There's so much noise that it's hard to tell what's true and what's not. Corporations tell us half-truths and hide the details in the fine print of terms and conditions. Political parties tell us they prize transparency, and then they keep their donor list hidden from the public. Media companies say they are reporting the news and then just tell us what they think they want us to hear. And because we live in information bubbles and tune out those who disagree with us, it's easier than ever to believe the propaganda we are fed is actually true, which is how you end up with people buying conspiracy theories from everything from COVID-19 to the vaccinations, to 9/11, to Brexit, even to the validity of our elections. You see, trust isn't only a word companies like to stick on their websites or politicians like to put on their platforms. No, trust is a foundational part of everything we do in a functioning society. And without it, we simply can't be one. That's why we've got to reverse current trends and repair the damage that's been done. And here's some good news. I think we can, as long as all of us step up and do our part, as long as we do everything we can to build relationships of trust in our own lives. We are the individuals that make up businesses, institutions, organizations, and governments. And by taking action in our own lives, we can spur a larger change. Now, I know I'm not the guy you'd expect to show up here with a hopeful message about trust. I've spent my career being lied to by murderers, traffickers, and terrorists, by folks whose friends and relatives describe them as they were a good person or they were a good parent before they committed unimaginable atrocities. But here's the thing. I'm not asking you to be trusting of others. I'm asking you to be more trustworthy yourselves, for you to build more trusting relationships in your own lives, for you to be the change you want to see, because trust is built one person at a time and one day at a time. But that's easier said than done. So I want to offer a few lessons I've learned over my career, figuring out how to earn trust and give others the chance to earn mine. Now, I want to be clear. Earning trust is different for everyone. What has worked for me won't necessarily work for you. But at the very least, I want to show you that it's possible, even with a job like I had, where I took on fake names, fake identities, and sometimes even fake girlfriends. And for me, the first step in doing so has always been to be authentic. Why? Well, in a world where our lives are more open than ever, I think many of us are living with our guard up. But we need to be all willing to give a bit before expecting to earn someone's trust. We need to be showing them who we really are if we want them to reveal who they really are. Of course, when I was in law enforcement, this wasn't always easy. Think about the cops you see on TV, John McClane in Die Hard, or Jimmy McNulty in The Wire. These guys aren't exactly the soft and mushy types, bearing their souls. But when I was in the FBI, I realized pretty quickly that the best agents didn't approach suspects or sources with closed fists, but with open minds. Early in my career, I developed a source named Gordo. I met Gordo when we were called by an East Texas sheriff who said they had arrested our bank robbery suspect. Myself and an older agent traveled several hours to the jail and took custody of Gordo. He refused to say a word. He wasn't wearing a shirt. Looked like he hadn't eaten in a day, and he was covered in prison and gang tattoos. On the way back, the older agent pulled over the car at a drugstore in a small town. He went in, he came out with a shirt, a hamburger, and a Coke, and he gave it to Gordo. I could tell after Gordo put the shirt on and had eaten the hamburger, he was more willing to interact. And soon, Gordo and I were talking about his family and his life in Texas. And Gordo was willing to talk about other things. But Gordo had a rap sheet so long, you could be at Cambridge by the time you finished reading it. Not that you'd ever want to go to Cambridge, but I liked Gordo. And he helped me solve murders. He untangled webs of gang activity for me. And all in all, I knew the people of Texas were safer when he was talking to me than they would be if he stopped. The problem was, Gordo kept on committing crimes. I'd visit him in jail and we'd talk about his family and other things. Now, most people would have given up on him or threatened him or just left him in jail. Instead, I decided to befriend him. One day, I brought my girlfriend, my real one, and now my wife, over to Gordo's house for dinner. His wife cooked a great Tex-Mex dinner. His kids were running around. We had fun. And sometimes, if I knew he needed money to support his wife and kids, I'd give him a 20. And more importantly, I developed a playbook that was one that was built on trust between us. It wasn't necessarily the FBI way, but it was another way. And it was my way, and it was me being me. And in the process, I showed Gordo that I trusted him. And as a result, he came to trust me. Our relationship was stronger for it. Our community was safer for it. The lesson here is one I think anyone can apply. No matter how tempting it is to keep your cards close to your vest, the best way to build relationships and build trust is to be yourself and show who you really are. I didn't just talk to him in my FBI suit. I drank beer with him at a local barbecue joint. I had dinner with him and his family. It might not have been following the FBI playbook, but I was being myself, and he knew that. Because when you do that in front of others, they'll do that in front of you. Now, here's the thing. When people are authentic in front of you, they're going to say some things you don't like. Which brings me to my second tip for building trust. Listen to them anyways. And don't just listen to them, actively listen. If you disagree with their point, debate them in a way that acknowledges where they are coming from. Incorporate what they are saying into what you are saying. Be open to the idea of changing your mind, even if you won't always do it. I know it can be hard to listen, especially these days. We live in a world that's noisier than ever because of social media. It's hard to hear what people are really trying to say. Everything has a label. Everything has a hashtag. And we're also quicker to rush to judgment. These days, one tweet can define a person and lead us to dismiss everything else they say. But with so much noise all around us, it's actually more important than ever for us to be active listeners, paying attention to both what people say and also how they say it. What are they communicating with their facial expressions, with their gestures? What is not being said? At the FBI, I had to master the art of listening because I needed to be able to pick up on any information I could gather, whether it was from an interrogation or from my executive team. And I brought that same skill set to the private sector at PwC, where I help companies that are in crisis. For example, some of you maybe remember the Equifax breach. Equifax is a consumer credit reporting agency that has a lot of personal identifiable information. This data breach resulted in more than 140 million Americans and 15 million Britons' personal information being compromised. I led PwC's response to this incident, and I worked with the Equifax executive team to help. As you can imagine, the reaction was immediate and critical. The press was not kind. Their stock price declined. And most importantly, the folks impacted, you and I, they were furious. There were many angry tweets and calls and emails. It was easy to think that their customers were done with them, that it was over. And at the beginning, their executives and lawyers were concerned about openly communicating, and for good reason. Class action lawsuits were being threatened. The regulators were demanding answers now. But in tough times like these, it's especially important to truly listen, to look at more than just what the media was saying and some initial statements of anger, and to try to get a full picture of what those customers were really trying to say. And Equifax did that. They flew customers down to their headquarters and hosted discussions on what happened and listened to their input. Internally, they hosted town halls and talked to their employees about the incident. They created a new website where they could accept customer feedback. And what they learned is behind all those angry statements, their customers, you and I, wanted to know what exactly happened. How was the company holding itself accountable? What was being done to make sure it would never happen again? And slowly but surely, they regained trust. Fast forward today, their stock price is higher than ever. Their employees are proud to walk through that front door. And many of those impacted, you and I, those customers remained, and more have actually joined Equifax. You know, I practically lived with the management team for many months, several months. I have to commend the management team. They were exceptional. They were willing to change, they were willing to listen, and they were willing to do the right thing. The point is this: building trust in relationships isn't linear. In today's world, it's tempting to tune someone out if they're saying something that's tough to hear. But all of us benefit when we take the time to truly understand where each other is coming from. Truly listening requires patience and persistence. Now, I want to clarify, listening is important, but it's also important who you listen to. And that brings me to my third step in building trust: seek out diversity of thought. These days, more and more, people are seeking out validation rather than differing points of view. Many of us are setting up online bubbles that only reinforce our current beliefs. And the algorithms behind social media platforms are making all of this worse by only showing users what they want to see. This is dangerous because solving big problems demands that we establish trust with people who are different from us. Just look at Abraham Lincoln, who designed his cabinet team to be a team of rivals because he realized the best way to find answers to hard questions was seeking out as many perspectives as possible, including ones different from his own. Throughout my career, I've taken that idea to heart. I've tried to understand my biases, own my emotions, and take them out of the equation, and actively reach out to those whom I don't always see things eye to eye. And let me give you an example. From the outside, the FBI and the CIA might seem pretty similar. They're both three-letter acronyms. They're both staffed by people in suits. And in the movies, James Bond can't trust either one of them. But in reality, the two organizations have real differences: different cultures, different missions, and different purviews. And while we're not quite adversaries, we are kind of like overly competitive siblings. When the CIA is on a domestic mission, we want them off our turf. And when the FBI is on an international mission, they want us off theirs. But the reality is, it's actually integral to national security that we work together, that we actually put our diverse perspectives together. After all, one of the issues related to the 9/11 attacks was the lack of communication between agencies across the executive branch. So when I took over national security at the FBI, I decided I would do my best to bridge that divide and aggressively seek out their input, precisely because it was different from ours. And to that end, most Fridays, I traveled the 10 miles to Langley, CIA headquarters, to meet my counterpart. Sure, I could have been hurt that he didn't ever come visit me at the beautiful Hoover building. I'm being sarcastic, people. Those of you who've been in DC, the Hoover building, FBI HQ, is probably one of the least beautiful buildings in DC. But instead, I decided what was most important with my counterpart was that we spent time each week listening to one another. I wanted to hear what he had to say. I wanted to learn what he was up to. I wanted his thoughts on what we were up to. And I knew that even if we had our differences, both of our agencies would be more effective if we were rowing in the same direction. And we ended up putting out a joint communication about coordinating and working together. And the FBI and CIA have been incredibly successful working together, not because of me or my counterpart, but because the people of each organization began trusting one another. And that's what I hope you will do as well. If you're on board with rebuilding trust in our society, don't try to do it with folks you already get along with. Seek out your rivals, your enemies, your nemesis, people who are different. Get to know them. You don't have to become best friends. But when you offer olive branches, you plant the seeds of a more trusting society. All of you have the ability to help lead this movement to restore trust. You've already shown that you're curious and ready to engage on the toughest issues facing our world. So if you remember nothing else from this talk, remember this ask from me to you. Please make building trusting relationships a priority in your own lives. Commit yourselves to helping others, to earning the trust of others, and to giving them the time and space to earn yours. It may seem like a small step, but if that continues to scale, then by definition, we'll have a more trustworthy world. Those corporations, those institutions, those governments that are made up of you and I, they'll become more trusting ones. And we need to make that happen, because this really does feel like an inflection point for humanity. And if we keep going the way we've been going, we'll grow more distance from each other. But we still have time to choose another direction. And that's the direction of sowing our divisions and learning once again to have faith in one another. Getting there is going to take effort, but I know we can do it. And it starts with having conversations just like this, which is why I'm grateful for everyone who took the time to listen to me today, and why I'm going to give you a chance to interrogate me. Thanks, everyone.
Sean, thank you so much. I'll definitely be Googling some of those people reading skills to practice on my friends after this talk. Let's start at the beginning. Most people wouldn't associate, like you said, a spy with being trustworthy, but you began in the FBI as a special agent. What made you decide to enter into that work?
That's a great question, Molly. See, you're making me think way back. I think all of us deep down want to do something with a mission and a purpose. And at the time I had just graduated from business school. I was thinking to go, I had done an internship on Wall Street. I was going to go in that direction. And I thought I would just, try something that was more mission focused, helping people, I thought, right? And wanted to kind of give back to society. And I said, I'm going to do this for 2 to 3 years. And then 26 and a half years later, I ended up coming out and retiring. So.
And what was the recruitment process like?
It was long. There were a lot of FBI style interrogations, a lot of interviews. There's a standardized test. There's a, physical fitness test. There's a psychological test. And then you go through sort of a board interview type of thing. So there's a battery of things you go through before you, are admitted and then go through the FBI Academy.
Cool. Later, you were appointed as Assistant Director of the FBI's International Operations Division. What skills did you have to learn to cooperate with the security services of other nations? And was that how you expected it to be?
That was a great experience, because you really get to delve into and understand other cultures. And trying to kind of come to a place where your missions overlap and you're trying to accomplish the same goal. So especially, not only did I lead international operations, but I lived in Europe. I lived in the Czech Republic and had responsibility. It's not the Czech Republic now, but I had responsibility for the Czech Republic and Slovakia. But I think, you learn there's a common purpose all around the world, right? I dealt with my British counterparts a lot, especially MI5 and New Scotland Yard and MI6 on occasion. So they're great, great partners. And, I think that common mission really unites us globally and helps us work together.
Do you think that Britain's departure from the EU will have an impact on the common goal and on how global intelligence sharing operates?
I hope not. I think it's critical. I don't know if the parts of Brexit would affect information sharing, especially in that. I don't think so. I think there's many strong relationships between the heads of agencies throughout Europe that will continue, and I think it will really bridge that gap, which is not based on economics, which is really based on how do we protect and serve the people of those countries.
You were obviously instrumental in bringing the CIA and the FBI together. What do you think that individual intelligence agencies across the world can do to work more in harmony?
So I don't know if I was a major part of bringing the FBI and CIA together. Hopefully I was one part, but thank you for the compliment. I do think that there has to be more norms established, especially like with cybercrime. So I don't think the norms have been set, as we've all witnessed some of the nation state attacks. I think that needs to be set. I think in this digital world that the agencies have to be able to set up, I think, more fluid and fast moving ways to cooperate versus, typical like letters of rogatory or what they call mutual assistance treaties.
So let's talk about cybercrime. As we said, you spearheaded several initiatives, including Next Generation Cyber. Since the initiation of this scheme, global cyber attacks have dramatically risen in frequency and severity. How do you think that the future of intelligence can cope with the changes in the cyber world?
So I would say right now we're all struggling kind of to deal with this issue. I think legislatures like our Congress, your Parliament, are struggling with how do we actually either form laws or regulations that are actually going to guide us. And then I think there also has to be, as I mentioned before, some type of international norms established. It is not being done quick enough. And I think there's this digital divide between sort of the younger generation that are more digital natives and maybe some of the congressional members here and parliamentarians there that didn't grow up and maybe have the same understanding. But it's going to be critical that I think we come to grips with this and are going to have to learn how we actually cooperate cross boundaries, because cyber is not limited by geographical boundaries. I would be a huge proponent of some type of international task force that actually addresses some of these issues that I think would be a constructive way.
That's very interesting. Do you ever feel uncomfortable about the amount of information that the internet sort of allowed you to gather about people and allows, I guess, now everyday people to gather about each other?
I do, and I always like to use this phrase. Many of us have, right, dozens of apps on our phone. And I say to people, if you didn't pay for the app, you are the product, right? So many of these companies, right, are collecting this information. Some of it, like we as customers may approve, but as I mentioned in my talk earlier about the terms and conditions, I think many of us, me included, just click agree after we scroll down and don't sometimes truly understand the information that we're giving up. There was, I was just looking, there was a great thing your version of, I'm trying to think of where entrepreneurs actually present. It's your version of the American Shark Tank. But there was someone there that just presented, I think last week, about how you can actually pay customers for using that data in making them realize and understand what data is being collected, and do they want to allow that entity to actually use it and monetize it.
And do you think the internet has rendered traditional methods of spying unnecessary, or of some secondary importance? How can we use that information in intelligence gathering?
So it is unfortunately being used each and every day in many, many different ways. So it concerns me. As we all know, based on geopolitics, I think in many countries throughout the world, the internet is more or less open depending upon where you are. But certainly the nation state activity that I mentioned earlier is increasing. And I think many countries will see the low barriers to entry and will be using this as a resource to further their national objectives.
So let's talk about counterterrorism, because both as an agent and a senior director, you spent a lot of time working in that field. How has the field changed during the course of your career?
So I think, let me start with the FBI, of course, after 9/11 changed dramatically, where they truly went from, I would say, more of a reactive organization to an intelligence-led, proactive organization. And I think that's the biggest focus, even in the field. How do we become, right, to gather and collect these vast troves of information and actually turn them into intelligence and actionable intelligence? So I think that to me has been the biggest shift in the field, where, I think historically the FBI was viewed where they'd show up after something happened, whether it was a bombing or a crime. And now it's about how do you actually prevent something from happening, and kind of, it's really that focus that I think has been a monumental change in the organization.
And what do you think the biggest threat to the security of citizens of nations like the UK and the US is today?
I think right now the cyber threat is one of the biggest threats. I think we've seen several countries try to influence elections. I think we've seen some major nation state attacks on ubiquitous software that many companies use throughout the world. And we're going to continue to see this. And as we talked about, there was an earlier question, we do not have the mechanisms right now to effectively deal with this issue. And we have to get on top of it.
The mechanisms that we have used in the past have always been sort of a little bit controversial. I wanted to ask you what you thought was justifiable for security services to use. Specifically, do you think it's okay for security services to resort to torture to obtain information, especially when it comes to counterterrorism?
So what I can talk about is sort of what we did in the FBI and made a conscious decision to focus on. We truly believe that during an interview or an interrogation, that the best way to elicit information is by building rapport with individuals. So the FBI is not an advocate of using torture. And that is, many times been talked about by the directors and deputy directors like myself. So I think it's important that we respect human rights and human dignity, and that we constantly look for ways of how to gather that intelligence that's critical, right? It's critical to both our country's national security.
And you spoke about building trust in law enforcement. Obviously, especially recently, there's been a lot of discussion about how the police and the FBI in America sort of aren't trustworthy to a lot of citizens. What do you think that they can do to rebuild that trust?
I think it's going to be a process. And unfortunately, as many people are aware, there was a lot of, I would say, conversations and discourse that was not helpful for building trust within these organizations. I'm talking specifically the FBI. I think, right, it is critical to the FBI's mission that they have the trust of the American public. It is vital. They can't do their job without that. And unfortunately, there was damage done, and it will take time to restore that trust. But I can tell you, the vast majority of the 36,000 men and women of the FBI do that job each and every day to work on building that trust. And it's going to take time. As far as, when you're talking about the police, they have an incredibly difficult job. Each and every day, they are called into a variety of situations that include people with mental illness, that include people with drug addictions, that include people with weapons that are trying to cause harm to other people. And it is, I think, we are on a journey here in the United States in trying, right, the public has to understand what is required by the men and women of the 18,000 agencies here in the United States that do that job every day and have to make split-second decisions. And at the same time, how do we help reinvent what they do and provide them additional resources that are going to help them deal with situations that it would take forever for every police officer to be a psychologist or a drug counselor, right? But how do we actually bring some of those community resources together effectively to make sure that we bring the best solutions to our communities?
And do you think the root of the problems of violence and racism in the police is a misallocation of resources, or do you think there's a deeper root?
I don't know if it's a misallocation of resources. I think it's something that we have to, right? It's a contract between the public and the city government or the county government, right? Where the men and women that protect and serve each day. And I think just like we talked about today, I think we have to have discourse on what the community expects from their law enforcement agency and really understand what training are we giving them to make sure that they're capable to deal with that, but also the public understanding what that job entails each and every day. Many of us have not been exposed to that. Fortunately, I have been exposed to that. And I think there are a lot of, as I mentioned before, split-second decisions that these men and women are asked to make every day. And most of the time, they make the right ones. But that doesn't mean we should stop looking at those times where the right decisions are not being made. And that does not mean that we don't hold people accountable. Everyone should be accountable, especially if they break the law.
I'm keen to move on to our audience questions, so I'll ask just one more question from me. Oxford has
Okay.
had a long history of producing spies and security agents for our own secret services. And the person who wrote my questions has made a slight jibe about where the spies from Cambridge may or may not have ended up working. But it's likely that some of our audience members might even go on to work for security services themselves later on in their life. What advice would you give them? Is it a field that you would encourage people to get into?
I think it is a fascinating field. I have no regrets for 1 year that I spent in the FBI. I think it's a terribly rewarding field, right? And I go back to, I think many of us deep down have some altruistic feelings, right? That we want to do something that we think is good for society as a whole. And I think the security services, right, are trying to protect, right, the people of England, of the UK, right, the United Kingdom, and even broader, right, the citizens all over the world. So listen, it is a very rewarding career. It's not for everyone. There are many ways you can give back to society with, outside the security services, but it is one that I found deeply rewarding. I found that the people had foundational values that, I shared. And I think it was a very enriching and rewarding experience.
Thank you. So on to the questions from our audience. One of our anonymous attendees has asked, do you believe that everyone is qualified to build up a trustworthy relationship with, or are some people just naturally not trustworthy, no matter how much time and effort you spend on them? And somebody else has sort of added to that by asking, how do we go about building trust but still avoid being exploited by others?
Good questions. I would like to say, I believe in the good of people, right? And I think there's a good in most people. Don't get me wrong, there are a very, very small minority where I have seen some sociopaths where I do question whether there was some goodness in there. But most people, right, there's good inside. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to try to reach out and do that. And what I see in the world today is that division I was talking about, and people not having the discourse with people who disagree with them. And I think we've got to get away from what I was talking about, those labels and hashtags, and have open discussions. You know, one of the reasons I love the Oxford Union is debate, right? It is like, it has different versions, different perspectives of what people bring. And we've got to get back to that. We can't just be overshadowed by social media and platforms that are only pushing out their versions of the truth.
Thank you. Anna asks, what is the most important skill to have in order to be employed by the security services like MI5?
So I can't speak for the MI5, but I know many of the folks at MI5. I think a common characteristic to many of these folks is actually being, it was one of my key points here, actively listening. When you're talking to someone, do you actually listen to them, or are you just kind of giving them the nod? I don't know, in the US, it's a great thing saying, how you doing? And like, you're not even looking at the person, you just keep walking. Right? It is, I would say that the trait of like actually listening to someone of what they're saying, picking up on those cues, so being observant and looking at that, and then being like curious, right? I consider all of us lifelong learners, right? And you have to have that curiosity and that willingness to meet people from all over the place that have different values, different perspectives, different cultures that I find exciting and interesting and fun.
Daniel asks, what is your favorite story of your time at the FBI?
Favorite story. I will tell you, I have been extremely fortunate, Daniel. I mean, I worked Colombian drug cartels. We did a drop over the Caribbean of 500 kilos in an undercover boat and brought that ashore. I was fortunate to work with a lot of the elite counter-terrorist teams. I was able to go to an undisclosed country and capture Amal Kazi, who basically was responsible for killing several CIA employees. So I feel truly, it was an honor and privilege to be able to work with the people that I worked with and to be able to do the things that I do. If I'm ever over in the UK, I'm happy to go to the pub and we can share some stories.
Leandro asks, could you talk a little bit about the dilemma between individual freedoms and human rights? To what extent can individual freedoms be sort of relativized in the name of national security?
So I don't think it's an either or, I think it's an and. And I think collectively, we have to have that discourse and the public needs to understand, right? Everyone understands the government cannot tell the public everything. However, the government needs oversight. So there needs to be a mechanism where that oversight is provided. But I would say, you know, that the human rights and the balance of national security, it's and. And do we collectively agree as a society that we're willing, right, to do this as well as do that? So I think it's an and, it's not an either or, but I think transparency with the public is key to that, to make sure that we understand the risk and maybe some of the things that we're giving up if we choose to do so.
There's been quite a few questions about leaving the FBI and moving into the private sector. One of them from Henry. A few days ago, the head of the SIS announced that they would be recruiting a new head of technical services from the private sector. Do you think that we'll see more cooperation between intelligence and the private sector in technology development?
I hope so. So that's a great question. And we need to work together. I would tell you, I used to read the intelligence book with the top members of the intelligence community every day. And what we're seeing now is most of the information is held by corporations. It used to be held by government, but now with the troves of information out there in open source, it is really the other way around. That paradigm has shifted. And I think it's incredibly important right now that governments and the private sector, right, join together in those public-private partnerships in the name of national security to help protect everyone. And that doesn't mean giving up the personal information of customers, et cetera. What it means is that they're working together in the common goal of protecting us as a community and protecting us from a national security perspective. And that's a great question, because I think we're just at the beginning stages and we need to explore that much further. And I am a big proponent of secondment. So people from the private sector should actually be seconded into some of the security services. In the other way around, I think I would have been a much more valuable executive in the FBI if I maybe had seconded during my tenure at the FBI to a technology company and understand some of the challenges that they deal with. So I think it's a great beginning, and we have to continue going down that road.
Speaking of national security, Kate asks, were you surprised that the FBI and other agencies were unable to predict the storming of the Capitol in January? What lessons should be learned from such a potent reminder to the fragility of democracy?
So that is a great question. I think there's been a lot of news and information about what was available, what was not. I think we've all seen various programs that show that. I think many of the agencies walk a fine line about what information they legally collect. And so I think there's a challenge there as far as where sometimes you and I, as just ordinary citizens, can collect some information that actually governmental agencies cannot. So I don't know if I would call it a intelligence failure. I think what I would say is we need to look at, as they're doing, right? We need to look at what happened. What are the signals we missed? Obviously, we've all heard in some of the online forums, there was discussion prior to, what happened January 6th. And I think we've got to do sort of a root cause analysis is what I would call it. And we need to kind of go back and figure out what happened and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Sean, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about today. We'll finish with one final question. If you could bottle all of your sort of expertise and advice into one thing for our listeners to take away with them this afternoon, what would it be?
So I'm going to go back to, please build trust in your own lives. It is up to us. It's easy for all of us to talk about the companies out there, but I really mean it. It's one person at a time, one day at a time, and we can do that. We are the ones that make up all those organizations, institutions, and governments. So I think that's the message I want to leave you with. Throughout my career, I've utilized that, and it continued to help me and build those successful relationships. And I would ask everyone to sort of, go on that journey with me. I want to say, Molly, you've been a great host. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank everyone out there for taking the time today to listen to me. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, Sean. I hope you do join us in Oxford soon and come to the pub with us, tell us all of your FBI stories. Be sure to check out our events for later this week, and I hope to see you all soon.